In coming in here today, I figured, looking at the agenda, one, that somebody was going in front of me, so I'm very glad Chad talked about plant succession and things like that, so I don't have to. But also, kind of my wheelhouse has been fire and grazing and things like that. So this is something that we're getting to do with brush treatments and mowing that is oftentimes more familiar to the urban landowner that I'm typically dealing with. Absentee folks coming out of Houston, Austin, Dallas, moving in towards the rural landscape surrounding College Station. And these are things they're familiar with. They're less familiar with the cattle aspect of operations. They're less familiar with burning and the equipment and the expertise that goes along with that. And these are things they can easily understand. So when I go meet with them, one of the things I often tell them as we go through these areas is our areas with brush are too thick and our openings are too open and not heterogeneous enough. And that's kind of a principle that guides a lot of what I'm going to talk about today as we go through this. So in building this, I didn't want to get too caught up in specifics because Texas and Oklahoma, for that matter, are both large states with huge differences in rainfall patterns, species diversity that we're controlling across those ecoregions and things like that. We're talking about the rolling plains, or maybe these brush treatments might last for a couple of decades when you're talking about mesquite control up there because of growing season lengths and rainfall patterns. But in East Texas, you may do brush control in the last couple of years because you get so much rainfall and have such a long growing season. So as we go through this, there's a number of different species we're talking about. We're talking about brush. You don't have to go very far to look at juniper species that are overtaking the hill country here. Just right outside the gates of the Wildflower Center, you can see it in the roadsides as the juniper is overtaking the hill country. In East Texas, eastern red cedar taking advantage of some of this post-oak savanna country here in the photo. Mesquite, pretty much statewide. Weesach in parts of South Texas and South Central Texas. And then where I'm at in the sandy soils, Yopon, an evergreen shrub in the post-oak savanna, has pretty much made the post-oak savanna a post-oak thicket. You can't hardly walk through it. And then not to even mention the huge number of exotic invasives, ligustrum, Chinese tallow taking over the coastal prairie, Chinese privet taking over some of our bottomland hardwood forests in the southeast, and the list goes on with the exotics. So there's all those different things we're focused on and the things that drive that. So when we're talking about brush management, it's less about management or elimination, it's more about brush sculpting. How much brush can we deal with? How much can we manage? How much can we deal with to accomplish the goals we're going forward with? So we know that the mechanical treatments are oftentimes the last option because they're expensive on a per acre basis in relation to herbicide or fire. Those are often cheaper aspects across the landscape. But when we have these situations where fire has been excluded for 100, 150, some cases even longer years, it's oftentimes the only method to go back in and try to reclaim these landscapes. Go in, take them back kind of ground zero, and move forward from there in an integrated fashion. The problem is a lot of these species resprout. So a lot of the folks that we work with throughout our jobs, they like, the made for TV, set it and forget it. You do it once, like, okay, we're good. 20, 30 years later, it should be the same. We know that's not the case. These are dynamic, disturbance-dependent systems. So we often have to look at, okay, now that I've done the mechanical treatment, now it's either a burn regime or a herbicide regime to keep these resprouts under control, especially when we talk about mesquite, Yopon, and many of these other species other than like eastern red cedar where you cut it and you're good to go. Because as we all know, if you cut mesquite, pretty much all you've done is really piss it off, right? It'll come back a lot thicker and even thornier and everything else. So for these small landowners that I'm working with in my area, it's often a rental strategy. So they can go to these rental companies. This is a piece of equipment from a Bobcat dealership there in Bryan College Station. I have landowners use. You can rent it for a weekend, go out there and try to clear some of these Yopon areas and try to encourage some diversity, some savanna openings and things like that. But for larger landowners, you're often looking at ownership of the pieces of equipment and all the upkeep and maintenance that goes with that and having enough land and enough activities to validate that ownership. One of the landowners who spoke earlier was a great example. If he had enough to do it himself, and he turned it into a business. That's awesome. Taking that across the landscape. And we're seeing that more as these brush mulchers become more economical in my area. We've had 3 or 4 small businesses pop up, and in the same manner, as soon as they get done with one job, they get into another one. So to bring it to us, a case study here, this is a post-oak savanna in east central Texas, a sandy land. That's kind of the transition from true tallgrass prairie to the piney woods to the east. And most of the area that I work in, this is an image from our Gus Singling Wildlife Management Area, a property owned by Texas Parks and Wildlife. And so we have these large canopy trees, post oaks with a diverse forb and native grass assemblage underneath, great quail habitat and things like that. Historically, that has pretty much been eliminated as with the absence of fire over time, we've devolved into this. Something that is essentially impenetrable. You have to crawl through it. So it's not difficult to see that there are very few flowering, nectaring resources there. Yaupon is an excellent pollinator plant for about 3 weeks in March and April. A lot of our beekeepers in my area, that's the majority of their honey. It comes from this plant over a 3-week pollination period. But after that, not a whole lot is growing except for a few shade-tolerant species underneath, and then along the margins where you have a fence line clearing and things like that. So with the help of some Partners for Fish and Wildlife dollars, this was in an endangered species habitat for Houston toads. We went in and did some brush mulching. And you can see that what we're really trying to do is eliminate that understory shrub from 5 to 25 feet tall that allows that light resources and soil space to be taken advantage of. All we did was mulch it, and you can see how much sunshine is hitting that forest floor. And then just wait. And in 2 years, because of the rainfall we have there, we had a great plant response. It doesn't take a biologist or somebody with a couple of biology degrees to see that that's much better for many wildlife species than what was in the previous slide. You know, we've got yellow Indian grass there with bunch grass for quail cover or bumblebee nests or whatever else. You've got lots of American beautyberry, different fall flowering aster species in there, and all sorts of different things providing good habitat. And the same deal, this is only 4 months after the treatment. And the reason I put this in there is you can see some of that integrated management. This landowner knew that yaupon is a prolific resprouter. So he had a plan, like we were talking about. He had a management plan in place and knew that when that yaupon resprouted, he was going to have to go back in there and spot spray it. He didn't want to broadcast spray because he didn't want to kill all the other beneficial species that would be there. So he came back in, spot sprayed the yaupon, and that's the brown you see there in the background. And I put this picture in there because this is sand palafoxia. This landowner had owned this property for 35 years, about 75% heavily wooded with that yaupon understory. He had never seen this plant during that time. All we did was disturb it, and I'm guessing it was sitting there for that period of time in the seed bank and responded to the treatment. So there's things that are there in some of these that we don't have to plant. And so 2 years later on that same site, from the first picture earlier, this was 4 months, this is 2 years later, that's some Maximilian sunflower in the foreground, sand, love grass, a lot of American beautyberry. And I wish I'd had a video because right after we took this, right there behind my nephew, we jumped 2 fawns out of the deal, which was kind of nice too. It's like, I'm a good biologist sort of thing, you know. Yeah, a little reward for you, a little reward for your efforts and your planning. It's very different, you know. Brush management takes different views depending on the location of where you're at. This is in deep South Texas. So instead of dealing with trees that are 30, 40, 50 feet tall like we do in my area, we're talking about diverse brush species that may only get 10, 12 feet tall at most, maybe a little taller in some of your riparian areas. So this, for those that don't know, a large piece of equipment that goes by many different names. This one, in this case, they call it an aerator. And essentially what they're doing is trying to manage for quail, but as we all know, it benefits many other grassland species, including monarchs. Down here at the bottleneck, this was near Hebronville, if y'all are familiar with that area, east of Laredo. So they went through and disturbed it and left little mots of brush. And this is a lot to do with the impacts, what Chad was talking about, when you're talking about when you're doing a management principle. So we've all seen brush management projects that become scorched earth, right? They remove 100% of the brush. If I'm a quail, that is not a good thing. If I'm a species that needs any sort of brush to hide from thermal issues, that is not a good thing. So they wanted to reduce it down to 10 to 20% brush cover, and that's what they did. So it looks pretty rough when you're done. And when you're working with urban landowners, as Bill Bartish was mentioning earlier, this is a hard sell. They think, oh my God, what have I done to the property I just paid thousands of dollars for? And so it's difficult because, like you said, it's an eye appeal, that aesthetic. And you have to hold them, a lot of times there's a lot of hand-holding for us field biologists as they get their initial feet wet with some of these practices, and it'll be okay. And so in 2 years, it'll eventually hopefully turn into something like this. Diverse native grass assemblages, not affected by bufflegrass and tanglehead, many of the other invasive species down there. And when we were going through this, doing some of our assessments, you know, we were finding 3 to 5 flowering plants per meter squared in these plots. So obviously some good pollinator habitat out there is where many solitary bees were sighted and things like that as well. And again, this is on the sand sheet in the same area. You can see roughly the same treatment. You got bush sunflower, you know, a lot of the bee balms and other things taking advantage there for those pollinators. So then moving on from brush control and talking about mowing. So this is one that a lot of folks have a bad image about it. It's not a bad word, right? What I think of when I think of mowing, I think of my own father. You know, one of his favorite things to do is a Sunday afternoon. It's like, well, there's nothing else to do. It's not football season. I think I'll go hop on the lawnmower and mow for a few hours, right? It's that recreational mowing of 4 to 5 acres at a time. It kills me, you know? But he's at least left the spring wildflowers alone now, so I give him credit for that. But what we don't think about is oftentimes for these folks, there's limitations. If we're in the urban interface, the area we're at now is lucky. They have a lot of expertise and individuals who are able to help them burn some of their demonstration sites. But if I'm an urban landowner with 1 to 2 acres outside of town and a school and a hospital next to me, it's not feasible because of smoke concerns and things like that to burn. But they can mow, and if they mow at the right time, it can be beneficial. Talking about scale, sometimes it'll cost the same amount of planning and staff to do a 5-acre burn or a half-acre burn as it would to do a 500-acre burn out in a rural landscape. So sometimes it's not economically feasible from a manpower or equipment standpoint. So those are the reasons that mowing can be a viable thing, but it's all about frequency. How often are they mowing? The timing, the intensity, so the height that they're mowing. Are they removing all growing points down to the ground level? Or are they mowing high and just kind of setting it back and allowing sunlight to hit the ground and open up space for forbs and other annual grasses to come in and fill those voids? So this is an example. That's my model leg pose there for, if you're wondering whose leg that is. This was a grassland restoration I did in East Texas, and we planted about 20 species of native plants and forbs on formerly Bermuda and Bahia grass pasture, and it had been pretty much overtaken by woolly croton, doveweed, goatweed, whatever you want to call it. And the landowner was very concerned, and so he wanted to do something. He didn't know what. So I suggested a high mowing. So you can see that's kind of about boot top height, maybe mid-calf, something like that. And we went through and we knocked off the tops. And so what it did is it did enough to open up that light to allow those perennial climax grass and perennial forb species that we planted the ability to grow through. But at the same time, it didn't knock them back down to ground level to where, even though they had just sprouted, if we had mowed them to the ground, some of them might not have been able to recover. The root reserves would not be there to keep going. So we just knocked off the tops to reduce some of the weed pressure and allow those plants to establish. So that's one benefit, one way you can use mowing to your advantage. This is an example of kind of a serendipitous mowing event. This is a property I'm working with who's actually doing about 300 acres of native grassland restoration, but he had mowed this area in the late winter for actually a field trial that was taking place on his property. And as a response to that late winter mowing, he removed all the thatch that had been there, and we got a huge response from green milkweed, Asclepias viridis. So we had about 5 acres of this stuff spread throughout, and some places even thicker than this. And so it became a good learning opportunity. Later that time, we were able to go out and hand collect some milkweed seeds to put into the rest of his restorations on the 300 acres. And so we went out there, and if you've ever hand collected it, you know how covered in silk and everything else you can get. But it gave me the opportunity, being based out of College Station, to take advantage, allow some AgriLife Extension staff and 2 A&M students to come out and get some hands-on conservation work, seeing how it's important, understanding seed availability issues with milkweed and those sorts of things. And we were able to gather up about 4 to 5 pounds of milkweed in a couple of hours, about 2 hours. And so, on the commercial market, that would run you a couple $100. It's not cheap. But we were able to at least put it out on some of the areas that we'd be restoring otherwise. So there's some opportunities there set forth by the mowing. Other examples of way to use mowing to the benefit. So this is an example of a prairie I went to owned by the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska on the Platte River prairies. And so there they're doing a patch burn grazing system to manage some of their prairies. So in the foreground and in the background, both areas were burned in early spring. The foreground was grazed, the back half was not. You can see the difference in structure, the difference in plant response. Where it was burned and grazed, grass has been hit hard, and there's a lot of different structure. You can see goldenrod, some other plants there, taking advantage of the cattle preferentially did not eat. And in the back, where they did nothing, it is pretty much a monoculture of big bluestem, which most of us think that'd be a good problem to have, but there, not much plant diversity, not much pollinator habitat there. The issue was they weren't able to burn as much as they wanted during their burn season. So the area that they had burned and grazed was getting hit too hard. So for those that don't know, cattle like fresh green grass, right? So what they did was they took a portion of the prairie and mowed it, and those cattle preferentially moved to the recently mowed area to take advantage of that regrowing grass, that more palatable grass that was there. And you can see the cattle there in the background. And so talking about those management principles and monitoring what you're doing, this is Chris Helzer from the Nature Conservancy, an excellent blog if you're concerned about grasslands. His Prairie Ecologist blog, great book as well, excellent promoter of grasslands in the central U.S., but he put forth these exclosure devices. And I encourage anybody who manages these lands to encourage folks to put forth exclosures so they can see what they're doing. We saw the example of that, I think, yesterday with some of the prairie coneflowers somebody had a photo of on their properties, but very important. But you can use mowing to to move your grazing pressure and not having to build a fence. It's easier to mow than it is to build a quarter-mile long section of fence and move that grazing pressure as well. So essentially, whether it be brush control or mowing, this is a very famous slide photo from a study in the 50s, but what you're really managing is canopy cover. And so on the far left, have thick, overgrown grass, not really palatable to cattle anymore at that point, kind of shading out a lot of your forage space. And as you remove that canopy of grass, you're going to reduce the root space as well. So you're reducing competition in two ways, not only for sunlight, but also for mineral and water resources in the ground. And that's important when we're talking about monarch conservation, because we're trying to promote that forbs and the floral diversity within those. And the same message holds true for brush as well. The photo I put forth initially illustrated that we need the sunlight reaching the ground. We often talk about grasslands, but our savanna systems are some of the most heavily impacted as well through brush encroachment, higher tree densities than where they're historically, and lack of disturbance. We're talking about shortleaf savannas in southeast Oklahoma and northeast Texas. Longleaf pine savannas in east Texas, or the post oak savanna that pretty much goes from Texas all the way through the Midwest, where you get more bur oaks and things like that. Just another slide illustrating the same thing. So overgrown on top, knocked back, you got the forbs coming up in between, and what we're focused on overall is our management goals. We're talking about diversity, not only in structure, but in species assemblages for pollinators, vertebrates, floral resources, and then scale. Are we working on an urban garden? Are we working on a few acres property? Or working on 13,000, 14,000 acres? There needs to be diversity across patches within those, whether it be at the small scale or the large scale. We need tall, weedy species and short, sprawling species as well. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions afterwards, and thank you very much for having me.